Before we begin today's story, I'd like to say a quick prayer for you, my dear family. May your days be filled with peace, your heart with joy, and your steps guided by light. Amen. If you're happy to be here, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Rain swept across the city like a curtain drawn by unseen hands, blurring the world beyond the tall glass windows of the Prescott building's top floor. Inside the penthouse office, light pooled in soft amber circles from recessed fixtures, catching the edges of polished mahogany and muted steel. Amelia Hart stood with her back to the storm, hands clenched at her sides, the hum of the elevator still echoing in her ears. She had told herself she wouldn't come here. She had sworn years ago never to set foot in this building, never to be in the same room with him. And yet, here she was. Across the room, Julian Prescott, CEO, self-made millionaire, man whose name was spoken in boardrooms with a mix of awe and caution, was on his feet. He looked nothing like the untouchable figure the newspapers adored. His tie hung loose, the top buttons of his shirt undone. His usually impenetrable gaze clouded with something raw, almost desperate. "Amelia," his voice was quieter than she expected, almost swallowed by the whisper of rain on glass. "Please, I wouldn't ask if there was anyone else, but there isn't." She didn't move, didn't blink. Her fingers curled tighter, nails biting into her palms. "You shouldn't even know my name, Julian. You shouldn't know I exist." His jaw tightened, but he stepped closer, hands open, as though approaching something fragile. "I know more than your name." His eyes searched hers, and she hated the way her pulse jumped at the intensity there. "I know you're the only one who can do this." For him. Her breath caught, not at the plea itself, but at the word he chose. Him. The child she had been forced to bring into this world and then sign away before she could even hear his first cry. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. "Why would I ever raise your heir? Why would I?" She broke off, shaking her head, forcing down the flood of memories clawing their way up. Julian's next words landed like a blow. "Because he's not just mine." The office seemed to shrink around her, the rain outside falling harder, as if the sky itself wanted to bury the truth before it could be spoken aloud. Amelia felt her legs stiffen, as if her body itself refused to process what he'd just said. The warmth of the room seemed to vanish, replaced by cold that seeped into her bones. "What do you mean, not just yours?" she asked, though every instinct screamed at her not to. She didn't want to hear his answer. She didn't want to open that door. Julian's gaze didn't waver. "I've spent 6 years building walls around the truth. I thought it was to protect him. Maybe it was to protect myself. But the walls are crumbling now, Amelia." Her lips parted in disbelief, her heart thundering so loudly she was sure he could hear it. "This is insane," she whispered. "If you called me here, too." "I called you here," he interrupted, voice low but edged with something unshakable. "Because I found out the truth too late. Because when they told me who his mother was, it broke something in me." She flinched at the word mother. It didn't feel like hers. It had never belonged to her. Julian took a slow step closer. "The child you think you lost that night. The one they told you you'd never see again, he's alive. He's here. And he needs you more than anyone." The air in the office thickened until every breath felt like swallowing glass. Images she'd locked away clawed at her mind. Sterile hospital walls, the acrid smell of antiseptic, the sound of a newborn's wail muffled by distance, and her own helpless cry as they wheeled him away. "You don't know what you're asking," she said finally, her voice shaking. "You're asking me to tear open a wound that never closed." "I know," Julian said quietly, "but you're the only one who can stop it from bleeding out completely." Her nails dug deeper into her palms. "And why should I trust you?" He hesitated. His next words weighted with something she couldn't read. "Because I was lied to, and because he's dying." Amelia froze. The memory didn't arrive gently. It slammed into her, a tidal wave from a night she had spent years trying to bury. The hospital corridor had been too bright, an endless stretch of white tiles that reflected the harsh fluorescent light overhead. Her body ached in places she didn't know could ache, the kind of deep, trembling exhaustion that came after hours of pain. Somewhere nearby, a machine beeped steadily, indifferent to the fact that her world was splitting in two. "Push, Amelia. One more time." The nurse's voice had been firm, clipped, as though urgency was an inconvenience to be managed. She had pushed. God, she had pushed until her throat was raw from silent screams. And then suddenly it was over. There was crying loud and fierce, her baby's first sound. But they hadn't placed him on her chest. They hadn't let her see him. Instead, a woman in a navy suit had appeared at her bedside, her face tight with professional detachment. "Miss Hart," the woman said briskly, "I need you to sign these papers." Amelia's head swam. What papers?" The woman's eyes flicked toward the nurses, and for a moment, the room's air seemed to shift, becoming colder. "The adoption forms, as agreed." No, the word rasped out of her throat, weak but certain. "I never." "Miss Hart," the woman cut in, her tone sharpening, "you're in no condition to discuss this. It's already been arranged. It's what's best for the child." She tried to sit up, but hands pressed her gently, too gently, back against the bed. A nurse whispered something she couldn't catch, and the suited woman stepped aside. For just a heartbeat, Amelia saw him. Tiny, red-faced, fists curling at the air. Her chest had ached in a way no physical wound could mimic. "Please," she had begged, reaching out. "Let me." But the image vanished as quickly as it had come, the baby's cries growing fainter down the corridor. That was the last she saw of him. The storm outside Julian's office roared back into focus, and Amelia blinked hard, forcing the memory back into its cage. "Dying?" Her voice cracked over the word. Julian nodded once, the motion heavy. "He has a rare heart condition. The doctors say his best chance isn't just treatment. It's stability. A home. Someone who can give him the kind of love. I can't." Her throat tightened. "And you think I can just step into that role after 6 years?" "I think," Julian said slowly, "you're the only one who ever could." Julian had learned long ago that power came with its own kind of loneliness. From the outside, his life looked like a string of victories. Magazine covers, keynote speeches, deals closed with a stroke of a pen. But every win felt hollow when the applause faded. He had built Prescott Industries from a single warehouse into a global brand, yet there was no one waiting at home to share the spoils. 6 years ago, he hadn't planned on becoming a father. In fact, he hadn't known he was a father until the hospital called. The woman he'd been involved with a brief, reckless entanglement had died suddenly, leaving behind a premature baby boy. They said there were no living relatives on her side. Julian remembered telling his lawyer. They said the child had no one. He had taken the boy in without hesitation, though he'd had no idea what fatherhood required. He was 32, running a company that consumed his every waking moment. The boy, Daniel, had been small enough to fit in the crook of his arm, his heartbeat rapid and fragile under Julian's hand. Julian had promised himself he'd never let anyone hurt this child. But the truth, the one that now burned in his chest, was that someone had already been hurt. The woman who had given birth to Daniel. The woman who had been told her child was gone. Her, Amelia Hart. He hadn't learned her name until 3 months ago, when a misplaced file landed on his desk. A copy of the original birth certificate, unaltered. It bore her signature. And for the first time in years, Julian felt the ground shift beneath him. The anger had come first, at the system, at the lies, at the fact that someone had decided for them that they'd never meet. Then came guilt, sharper than any boardroom betrayal. And now there was fear. because the boy he had raised, loved, and claimed as his own had a failing heart. The best specialist in the country could operate. But Daniel's recovery depended on more than surgery. He needed emotional grounding, a connection deeper than what Julian's money could buy, the kind of connection only a mother could give, and not just any mother, the one who had carried him. Julian looked at Amelia now, her amber brown eyes locked on his, guarded but blazing with questions. She didn't realize it yet, but in his mind, the decision was already made. He would convince her, because failure, in this case, meant losing Daniel. And that was something Julian Prescott would never allow. Julian could still remember the first night Daniel had slept in his penthouse. The nursery had been hastily prepared, white walls, a crib assembled by his assistant, a mobile of silver stars that spun lazily when the air vent clicked on. Daniel had cried for hours. Julian had paced the floor, a man who could negotiate multi-million-dollar mergers, but couldn't figure out how to soothe a baby who fit into the bend of his arm. He'd tried rocking him, humming an old tune his mother once sang, even making a complete fool of himself, whispering nonsense words. Finally, in a moment of exhausted desperation, he'd pulled the boy against his chest and said, "It's all right, kid. I've got you." The crying had quieted. Just like that. He'd stood there for almost an hour, afraid to move, listening to the tiny breaths even out. That was the night something shifted inside him. He had never said it out loud, not to Daniel, not to anyone, but from that moment on, the boy wasn't just his responsibility. He was his reason. Now, 6 years later, Daniel's laughter was the only sound that could cut through Julian's work-driven haze. The boy had his own small room overlooking the city skyline, shelves crowded with toy cars and stacks of illustrated books. Saturday mornings were their ritual, pancakes, cartoons, the occasional trip to the park if Julian could manage to leave his phone behind. But lately there had been changes. The first time Daniel collapsed, it had been during a game of tag in the park. One moment he was chasing after another boy. The next he was on the ground, pale and gasping. Julian had scooped him up, heart pounding in a way that had nothing to do with running. The diagnosis had come swiftly and mercilessly. A congenital heart defect. Operable but risky. The specialists were confident. Yet they stressed the importance of emotional stability in the months before and after surgery. Julian had sat in the sterile office, listening as the cardiologist explained the psychological impact of maternal connection on a child's recovery. Biology matters, the doctor had said gently, especially in cases where trust and emotional grounding are needed. Sometimes the bond with a biological mother can help anchor a child through the fear and trauma of surgery. That had been the moment Julian knew he had to find her. And now she was here, standing in his office, eyes hard but shimmering with something he couldn't quite name. Julian leaned forward slightly, his voice lower, steadier. "Amelia, he's everything to me. But I can't give him what you can. If you walk away now, I'll have no choice but to face this without you. And I don't think that's what's best for him." For the first time since she'd walked in, she looked away. He felt it, just a flicker, but it was enough. The elevator doors slid shut with a metallic sigh, sealing Julian Prescott and his desperate plea behind her. Amelia pressed herself into the corner, arms crossed tightly, as if she could hold her ribs together against the ache blooming in her chest. The hum of the elevator cables rose around her, and she focused on the floor numbers flickering above the doors. Anything but the image of his eyes when he said he's dying. By the time she stepped out into the marble-floored lobby, the city's cold evening air was a relief. Rain had slowed to a fine mist clinging to her coat, softening the harsh glow of streetlights. She kept walking, ignoring the taxis idling at the curb, ignoring the way her heartbeat was still out of sync. She'd told herself for years that what happened in that hospital was fate, that fighting it would only rip her apart. But now fate had a name, a voice, a laugh she'd never heard. She stopped at a crosswalk, watching headlights smear across wet asphalt. Somewhere in a part of the city she'd never been, a 6-year-old boy carried her blood in his veins and had no idea she existed. Her mind flickered back to the months after the birth. The apartment she'd returned to had felt smaller than she remembered. The crib she'd saved up for sat against the wall, empty. She'd spent hours sitting beside it, tracing the carved wood, imagining what it would have been like to tuck him in. Friends had stopped visiting after the first few weeks. They didn't know what to say to the woman who'd gone into labor and come home without a baby. Her mother had tried bringing groceries, cooking meals, but she'd never once said his name. She didn't even have a name for him. The adoption papers had been blank in that space when she signed. A car horn jolted her back to the present. The light had changed. She crossed the street, her reflection fractured in the slick pavement. Julian's voice still echoed in her head. "You're the only one who can do this." She hated him for putting that choice in her hands. She hated herself more for not knowing her answer. Her apartment greeted her with its familiar stillness. The place was small, 1-bedroom, narrow kitchen. A living room just wide enough to fit the sofa she'd inherited from her mother. It smelled faintly of chamomile tea and the rain clinging to her coat. Amelia dropped her keys into the ceramic dish by the door, the sound echoing in the quiet. She took off her boots, shrugging out of her damp coat, and hung it on the rack. The urge to collapse onto the couch was strong, but instead she found herself walking to the hallway closet. She hadn't opened the top shelf box in years. Her fingers hesitated on the lid, the cardboard worn, soft with age. She told herself she kept it only because throwing it away felt wrong. But the truth was, it was the last thread connecting her to that night. Lifting the lid released a faint scent of lavender, from the sachet her mother had tucked inside years ago. Beneath it lay a folded hospital gown, a paper bracelet with her name printed in faded ink, and a small knitted cap, pale yellow, no bigger than her palm. Her breath hitched. She sat on the floor, knees drawn up, turning the cap over in her hands. She'd never known who knitted it, probably a volunteer, but she'd imagined it on his head more times than she could count. That image had carried her through nights when grief felt like a weight she couldn't lift. Now Julian's words tangled with that memory. "He's alive, he needs you." She closed her eyes and pressed the cap to her chest. A knock at the door startled her. She froze, the cap still in her hands. It was nearly 9, too late for neighbors, too early for trouble. Peeking through the peephole, she saw no one in the hallway, only an envelope, thick and cream-colored, resting against her doorframe. Her stomach knotted as she bent to pick it up. She already knew the handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper, Julian's signature at the bottom. Just 6 words, written in clean, deliberate script. He asks about his mother daily. The letter sat on her kitchen counter like a live wire. Amelia had tried to distract herself, making tea, tidying the stack of unopened mail near the toaster. But every time she turned, those 6 words stared back at her. He asks about his mother daily. She carried the mug to the couch, curling into her usual corner. Rain had started again, heavier now, rattling softly against the window. She flicked on a lamp, its yellow glow casting warm light over the room, but it didn't banish the shadow Julian's words left in her chest. Was he lying? Julian Prescott didn't strike her as the sentimental type. If anything, he was too precise, too calculated. But if he'd wanted to manipulate her, wouldn't he have written more? Added some elaborate plea, a threat, an emotional hook? No. 6 words, sharp enough to cut. She imagined the boy, her boy, sitting at some polished mahogany table in a penthouse dining room, staring at Julian with that simple, devastating question. "Where's my mother?" She gripped the mug tighter, the steam fogging her vision. And then came the fear. What if she said yes? What if she walked into that child's life only to fail him? She wasn't a mother. She didn't know how to be. And the last time she'd been in a hospital room with him, She'd been forced to let go. By midnight, the tea was cold, untouched. She rose and moved toward the bedroom, but her gaze caught on the closet door. The box was still on the floor where she'd left it, the yellow cap resting on top. She sat on the bed, turning it in her hands until exhaustion dragged her under. Her dreams were fragmented. Rain against glass, a child's laugh, a heartbeat monitor's steady beep. And when she woke, the cap was still clutched in her fingers. She didn't have an answer yet, but she had a direction. Julian's car arrived the next afternoon. It wasn't ostentatious, sleek black tinted windows, but it still fell out of place on Amelia's quiet street lined with cracked sidewalks and narrow driveways. The driver stepped out, immaculate in a dark suit, and opened the rear door for her without a word. She slid in, her pulse ticking fast. Julian was already inside, dressed in another flawless suit, his tie the only splash of color, a muted blue that somehow softened him. He didn't speak at first, just studied her as if gauging the temperature of her resolve. "You came," he said finally, his voice low. "I'm not promising anything," she replied, keeping her eyes on the window as the city blurred past. "I just want to see him. That's all I'm asking, for now." The drive ended at a glass-fronted building that seemed to catch every drop of light. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly with something expensive and floral. They took the elevator up to the 24th floor, the ride as silent as the car. When the doors opened, she heard it. Light, quick footsteps, followed by a laugh that didn't belong to Julian. He appeared in the doorway before they'd even stepped inside. Daniel, 6 years old, if Julian had told the truth. Messy, dark hair, a face that carried more of her than she'd expected. Wide brown eyes, curious but cautious, fixed on her like he was trying to place her. "Danny," Julian said gently. "This is Amelia." She crouched without thinking, so they were eye level. "Hi," she said softly. For a moment, he didn't answer, just studied her, his small head tilting. Then, as if deciding she passed some invisible test, he said, "Do you like puzzles?" The question caught her off guard, but she smiled. "I'm pretty good at them." He nodded once, then darted into the living room, calling over his shoulder, "I have one with dinosaurs." Amelia stood slowly, her throat tight. She could feel Julian's gaze on her, but she didn't look back. She followed the sound of Daniel's voice, the cap still folded in her coat pocket, like a secret. Daniel was already kneeling on the carpet when she entered the living room. The puzzle box tipped over, cardboard pieces scattered like bright confetti across the soft rug. "It's 100 pieces," he said, looking up at her with an earnestness that tugged somewhere deep. "Dad says I'm too young for it, but I think he's wrong." Amelia sat cross-legged beside him, picking up a jagged-edged piece with a splash of green. "Looks like part of a tail. What do you think?" He took it from her, squinting. "T-Rex. Confident," she said with a faint smile. "Let's see if you're right." For the next several minutes, they worked quietly, the only sound the gentle clink of puzzle pieces and Daniel's occasional muttered guesses. Triceratops, Stegosaurus, Velociraptor. His small hands moved quickly, eyes narrowing in concentration. From the corner of her vision, she saw Julian standing near the window. His posture was casual, but his gaze was locked on them, as if afraid to blink. When Daniel fit the last piece of the dinosaur's tail into place, he grinned. A sudden burst of light in the room. "Told you," he said proudly. "You were right," Amelia said. "You're good at this." He shrugged, trying for modesty, but unable to hide his satisfaction. "You can come back and help me with my space puzzle. It's harder." Something in her chest tightened. "Maybe," she said, her voice gentler than she intended. Julian finally spoke from behind them. "Why don't you show Amelia your books, Danny?" Daniel hopped up, grabbing her hand without hesitation. "Okay." The warmth of his small fingers in hers was startling, like something she hadn't realized she'd been missing until that moment. Daniel's room, was a world of quiet chaos. Bookshelves lined one wall, their shelves unevenly crammed. Some books neatly upright, others stacked sideways in haphazard piles. The bed was half-made, a dark blue comforter covered in constellations, one pillow slightly squashed. A model rocket leaned precariously on the desk, surrounded by colored pencils and scraps of paper filled with half-drawn planets. "This is my favorite one," Daniel announced, tugging a hardcover from the shelf. The cover showed a boy and a wolf silhouetted against a snowy forest. Amelia took it carefully, running her fingers over the worn spine. "Looks like it's been read a lot." "3 times, he said, climbing onto the bed and patting the spot beside him. "Dad says the ending's sad, but it's not that sad. It's just different." She sat, letting him flip the pages. His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "I like the part where the boy gets lost and has to find his way home, but I think the wolf is actually helping him." She listened, the sound of his small voice mingling with the soft hum of the city beyond the window. There was a steadiness to him, curious, thoughtful, but also a faint edge of loneliness she couldn't ignore. When he paused to turn a page, she asked, "Do you read a lot by yourself?" He nodded. "Dad's busy. He tries, but sometimes he has to work late. Maria, she's our housekeeper, reads with me sometimes, but she doesn't like the space books." Julian's shadow filled the doorway then, his hands in his pockets. "Danny, Maria's making lunch. Why don't you let Amelia settle in for a minute?" Daniel closed the book reluctantly, sliding it toward her. "You can borrow it," he said. Amelia held his gaze for a moment before smiling. "Thank you, Danny." As he ran off, Julian stepped into the room, his voice low. "He doesn't warm up to people like that. Not since," he stopped himself, looking away. The silence between them was weighted, filled with all the things neither of them was ready to say. Julian didn't move at first. He just stood there, framed by the doorway, his eyes tracking the space where Daniel had disappeared. Amelia set the book on the desk, breaking the silence. "You're worried about him." His gaze shifted to her, sharp but not unkind. "I'm responsible for him." "That's not the same thing." Something flickered across his expression, defensiveness, maybe even guilt, but it was gone before she could pin it down. He stepped farther into the room, leaning one shoulder against the wall. "You noticed it, didn't you? The way he holds back." She nodded slowly. "He's careful, like he's learned not to expect too much." Julian's jaw tightened. Children shouldn't have to learn that. The weight in his voice caught her off guard. She searched his face, looking for the man she remembered from 6 years ago, the one who had been both her undoing and the reason she'd spent sleepless nights wondering what could have been. "What exactly do you want from me, Julian?" she asked quietly. His answer came without hesitation. "I want him to have what I can't give him. I want him to feel safe, loved, like he belongs somewhere that isn't just a penthouse and a schedule." Her throat tightened. "And you think I can give him that?" "I know you can." His eyes held hers, steady and unflinching. "Because you already did once." She flinched at the implication, the unspoken truth between them pressing in like a tide she couldn't stop. "That's not fair. Life hasn't been fair to either of us." His voice softened, but the intensity didn't fade. "I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to see him." She broke the gaze first, her eyes falling on the small stack of books by Daniel's bed. "I'll think about it." Julian exhaled, as if he'd been holding his breath. "That's all I'm asking, for now." The late afternoon light was soft and golden as Amelia stepped out of the glass tower. The city hummed around her, car horns, a distant siren, the rhythmic shuffle of pedestrians, but she barely heard it. Her mind was still upstairs in that constellation-covered bedroom, with a boy who had looked at her like she was someone worth knowing. By the time she reached her apartment, the familiar scent of lavender cleaner and the quiet hum of the fridge felt almost jarring. She set her keys on the counter, kicked off her shoes, and sank onto the couch, elbows on her knees. Daniel's voice echoed in her head. You can come back and help me with my space puzzle. The casual invitation of a child who didn't know or didn't care about the tangled, painful history between the adults in his orbit. Her chest ached in that way it sometimes did late at night, when memories pressed in uninvited. 6 years ago, she'd been younger, softer. She believed in clean endings, until her own story was stolen from her before it even began. She had birthed a child she'd never see. At least, that's what she'd been told. She closed her eyes, pressing her palms to them, as if that could hold the grief in place, keep it from spilling over. But grief had a way of seeping through cracks you didn't know were there. The truth was, Daniel had her smile. Not the wide one she gave strangers, but the rare, tilted one she'd inherited from her mother. It couldn't be. She wouldn't let herself believe it. But when she lay down that night, staring at the ceiling in the dark, the shape of his small hand in hers was still there, warm and impossible to forget. The penthouse was quiet now. Too quiet. Julian stood in his study, the city glittering through the floor-to-ceiling windows behind him. His jacket hung over the back of the leather chair, his tie loosened, the first 2 buttons of his shirt undone. He had poured himself a drink an hour ago, but the glass sat untouched on the desk, amber catching the light. Daniel had gone to bed without protest, curling under the constellation blanket. Maria had said he seemed lighter tonight, more talkative at dinner. Julian knew why. He leaned back against the desk, his arms crossed. Inviting Amelia here had been a risk, a selfish one. For years, he had built walls high enough to keep out the truth, to keep her away. But those same walls were closing in on Daniel now, suffocating the boy in a silence he didn't deserve. Julian had sworn he'd never look her in the eye again. And yet, the moment she'd stepped into the room, something in him had shifted, like a gear that had been rusted stuck for too long. He told himself this was for Daniel, that the past was irrelevant, that the years of distance, the pain, the accusations, they didn't matter anymore. But then he remembered her expression earlier, when she'd asked, "And you think I can give him that?" Yes, he did. But he also knew he wasn't telling her everything. Not about Daniel's nightmares. Not about the nights he woke calling for someone who wasn't there. And especially not about the truth of how Daniel came into this world. Julian picked up the glass, staring into the liquid before setting it back down untouched. If she ever found out, he didn't know if she would walk away or burn everything down. It started with a knock on her door at 9 sharp. When Amelia opened it, Maria stood there, professional as ever in a neatly pressed blouse, hair pinned back, holding a leather tote. "Mr. Julian asked me to escort you this morning," she said, voice warm but efficient. The ride back to the tower was quiet, but Amelia's mind wasn't. She kept telling herself this was just helping. A child. For a little while. Nothing more. Daniel was already waiting in the library when she arrived, sitting cross-legged on the floor with puzzle pieces spread around him like a galaxy scattered in every direction. His head popped up the second she stepped in. "You came." His grin was all sunlight. "I said I would, didn't I?" Amelia dropped to her knees beside him, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "Now show me where we left off." He scooted closer, pointing at the half-formed image of Saturn. "This one's tricky. The rings keep confusing me." They worked in easy silence for a while, interrupted only by Daniel's occasional bursts of excitement when a piece clicked into place. Amelia found herself studying his profile, the little furrow of concentration between his brows. At one point, he glanced up at her. "You're better at this than Dad." "Is that so?" she asked lightly. "Yeah, he's busy." The boy shrugged, as if he'd already learned not to expect too much. Amelia's throat tightened. "Well, I've got time for you." A shadow crossed the doorway, and she looked up to see Julian watching them, hands in his pockets. For a moment, she thought he'd say something, but he only gave a faint nod and disappeared again. Still, She felt the weight of his presence long after he was gone. By noon, the puzzle lay completed on the low table. Saturn's rings a perfect sweep of color. Maria brought in lunch. Grilled cheese cut diagonally. A bowl of tomato soup and a plate of apple slices. "Eat here," she said with a smile, "so you can keep an eye on your masterpiece." Then she slipped out, leaving them alone. Daniel dipped his sandwich into the soup, then glanced at her. "Do you have kids?" The question caught her mid-bite. "No," she said carefully. "Why not?" Amelia gave a small shrug, masking a sting. Life just didn't go that way. He accepted that with the blunt practicality only children seem to have, focusing instead on fishing an apple slice from the plate. "I didn't have a mom when I was little," he said casually, as if reciting a fact about dinosaurs. Her hand stilled on the spoon. "Oh, Dad says she couldn't stay, that she had to go somewhere." He looked down, chewing slowly. "Sometimes I dream about her, but it's blurry. I don't think I really remember her." A quiet rush filled her ears, like the distant roar of ocean waves. She forced her voice to stay steady. "Do you wish you could see her?" He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "But I don't tell Dad that. He gets quiet when I do." Amelia felt her chest constrict, an ache pressing against her ribs. She wanted to ask more, but she knew pushing could scare him off. So she only said, "Well, I'm here now." Daniel smiled faintly, and for a second, it was like looking into a mirror from years ago. The penthouse was quiet when Amelia arrived later that evening, the city lights twinkling like distant stars. Julian was waiting in the living room, his expression unreadable. "Daniel seems to need more than just a babysitter," Amelia said, folding her arms. Julian's jaw clenched. "I provide everything he needs." She took a step closer, voice firmer. "Food and shelter aren't enough. He needs a father, a presence, a real connection. You can't keep shielding him from everything." He shook his head. "Some things are better left buried." "Like what?" He looked away, then back at her, eyes shadowed. "You wouldn't understand. Try me." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Julian sighed, running a hand through his hair. "There are nights he wakes screaming, calling for a name I can't say." Amelia's breath caught. "What name?" Julian's voice was barely a whisper. His mother's. She swallowed hard, the weight of the unspoken past pressing down. "I'm here, Julian, for Daniel, but I need the truth. All of it." He nodded slowly, the fight draining from him. "Soon, but not yet." The night air was thick with memories as Amelia lay awake in her small apartment. The distant hum of city traffic a dull soundtrack to her restless thoughts. She closed her eyes and was transported back to the sterile hospital room with a sharp scent of antiseptic mixed with the soft cries of a newborn. The pain, the fear, the overwhelming sense of loss as she was told she could never hold him, never be his mother in the way she longed to be. She remembered the cold metal of the bassinet wheels as they were wheeled away with the baby she carried inside her heart but never in her arms. The suffocating silence that followed, and the hollow ache that settled deep within her soul. Now, years later, that ache was stirred anew by Daniel's innocent questions and Julian's guarded truths. Could she open the door she'd slammed shut so long ago? Could she risk the heartbreak again for herself, and for the boy who might be more hers than she dared admit? Tears slipped down her cheeks as she whispered into the darkness, "I don't know if I'm ready." The following morning, Amelia found herself standing outside the bright, cheerful doors of Daniel's school, clutching a small notebook she'd borrowed from the library. Inside, the hallways buzzed with the laughter and footsteps of children. She was led by the school secretary to a classroom door, where a woman with warm eyes and a gentle smile waited. "Ms. Harper." Amelia introduced herself quietly. The teacher's smile softened. "I've heard a lot about you. Daniel speaks very highly." Amelia nodded, heart tightening. "I wanted to know more about him. how he is at school with other kids. Ms. Harper gestured inside. Come. Daniel's desk was neat, his backpack tucked carefully beside it. He's bright, curious, very imaginative, Ms. Harper explained. But he can be withdrawn at times, especially when things don't go his way. Does he talk about his family? Not much. He's mentioned his dad, of course, but rarely about his mother. Sometimes he gets sad, and then he'll draw pictures of a woman with stars in her hair. Amelia blinked, surprise prickling her skin. Stars in her hair? Ms. Harper nodded. Yes. He says she's magical, like someone from a storybook. It's his way of holding on to something he can't explain. Amelia swallowed the lump rising in her throat, feeling the fragile thread of connection grow stronger. Thank you, she said softly. This helps. It was late afternoon when Amelia found Daniel sitting alone in the park, a soft breeze rustling the leaves around him. She approached slowly, not wanting to startle him. Hi, Danny, she said gently. He looked up, surprised but pleased. Amelia? They sat side by side on the bench, watching as children chased one another beneath the dappled sunlight. After a while, Daniel spoke, his voice small but steady. Sometimes I feel like I don't belong, like I'm missing something important. Amelia nodded, understanding more than he could know. You belong, Danny, she said firmly. Sometimes it just takes time to find your place. He looked at her, eyes wide. Will you stay? She smiled, warmth spreading through her chest. I'm not going anywhere. For the first time in years, a quiet hope settled between them, fragile but real. The boardroom was cold, the sterile walls echoing with clipped voices and sharp glances. Julian sat at the head of the table, his usual composed facade cracking under the weight of relentless scrutiny. Reports piled high, deadlines looming, and shareholders demanding results that seemed increasingly out of reach. Mr. Prescott, your projections are optimistic at best, one executive said, tapping her pen impatiently. Julian's jaw tightened. We're navigating a challenging market, but I'm confident in our strategy. Another voice cut in. Confidence isn't enough anymore. We need tangible proof, or the investors will pull out. He nodded curtly, the pressure pressing down like a vice. Later, alone in his office, Julian ran a hand through his hair, staring out over the city skyline. The glow of the lights felt distant, disconnected from the turmoil inside him. His phone buzzed a message from Maria. Danny woke up screaming again. His breath hitched. The relentless tension in the boardroom melted away, replaced by a heavier weight of helplessness. He knew his son was hurting, but there was little he could do to fix what lay buried in the past. It was past midnight when Amelia's phone buzzed softly on the bedside table. A message from Maria. Daniel had a bad dream. He's in the living room. Amelia slipped out of bed, the house quiet except for the soft hum of the night. She found Daniel curled on the sofa, eyes wide and trembling, clutching a worn blanket. Hey, Danny, she whispered, sitting beside him and wrapping an arm around his small frame. He leaned into her, the tension slowly seeping out his body. I dreamed she was gone again. Amelia's throat tightened. I know it's hard, but you're safe here. You're not alone. He sniffled, nodding. Will you stay with me? She smiled softly. Always. They sat together in the stillness, the quiet comfort of presence soothing wounds that words couldn't reach. The early morning light seeped through the curtains as Amelia gently brushed Daniel's hair back from his forehead. He was asleep again, peaceful for now. She stood and looked around the room, memories swirling. The fragile hope she had felt was tinged with fear. Fear of what truths Julian was still hiding, and what would happen if those truths came to light. She knew she couldn't turn away anymore. Not from Daniel. Not from the past that bound them all. The tension in the penthouse was thick as Amelia entered Julian's study that evening. He was seated behind his desk, the weight of the day evident in the slump of his shoulders. She hesitated, then took a slow breath. Julian, I need to understand. About Daniel, about why you've kept me at arm's length. His eyes flickered with something raw, vulnerable. You deserve to know, but it's not easy. He stood and paced, struggling to find the words. Daniel's birth wasn't straightforward. There were complications, things I wasn't prepared for. Amelia's heart pounded. What happened? Julian's voice cracked as he admitted. He was born premature. I wasn't there. I was on a business trip. When I came back, I was told that you decided to keep him away from me. She swallowed hard. I had no choice. They pressured me, said it was for his safety. I blamed myself for years. Thought maybe I could have done more. He looked at her, eyes searching. I'm tired of living with secrets. I want us to be honest. For Daniel's sake. Amelia nodded, tears brimming. Me too. Amelia sank into the chair opposite Julian's desk, the weight of his confession settling heavily between them. It's been 6 years, she whispered, voice thick. 6 years of wondering if he ever knew who I was. Julian leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. I've lived with that guilt every day, but Daniel deserves better than silence and secrets. She met his gaze, searching for sincerity and finding it. I want to be part of his life. I want to help him heal. A flicker of hope crossed Julian's features. Maybe we can do that together. They sat in the quiet room, two fractured souls beginning the slow work of mending, both aware that the road ahead would be long, but for the first time, not impossible. Days turned into weeks as Amelia and Julian navigated the delicate balance of co-parenting. At first, every interaction felt like walking on eggshells, words carefully measured, glances laden with unspoken history. But slowly, those moments of tension softened into something almost familiar. One afternoon, Amelia found herself watching Julian play with Daniel in the park, the boys' laughter ringing clear and bright. It was a sound she hadn't realized she'd missed. Julian caught her gaze and gave a small, almost shy smile, an unspoken thank you for staying, for trying. For Daniel's sake, they were learning to trust again, to build a family from the shards of their past. One chilly evening, Amelia arrived at the penthouse to find Daniel sitting cross-legged on the floor, a battered storybook open in front of him. Julian was nearby, fingers tapping nervously against the armrest of the sofa. Read to me, Daniel said without looking up, voice hopeful. Amelia sat down beside him, the story unfolding in soft rhythms. Julian listened quietly, the tension between them easing just enough to allow a flicker of warmth. As the last page turned, Daniel yawned, eyes heavy. Julian stood, stretching out his arms. Time for bed, kiddo. Amelia watched as Daniel curled into Julian's side, a family forming in the quiet moments they shared, fragile and perfect, but theirs. The following days unfolded in a rhythm both new and tentative. Amelia found herself waking earlier, preparing breakfast for Daniel and Julian, the small routine stitching them closer together. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the kitchen window, Daniel tugged at Amelia's sleeve. Can we go to the planetarium today? Her smile was immediate, warmed by the boys' enthusiasm. Absolutely. Julian appeared behind her, crossing his arms. I'll come too. Daniel's grin widened, and Amelia caught the glance exchanged between the adults. Something unspoken, hopeful. At the planetarium, surrounded by stars projected on the dark dome, Daniel's wonder was infectious. Amelia and Julian watched as he pressed his hands against the glass, eyes wide. Later, as they walked home, Julian hesitated. Thank you for being here. Amelia nodded, heart full, but wary. For Daniel, try. And in that moment, beneath the vast artificial cosmos, they all glimpsed the possibility of a new beginning. Back at the penthouse, the quiet comfort of the evening was interrupted by a sudden knock on the door. Amelia opened it to find a woman in a tailored suit, a lawyer with documents clutched in her hand. "Mr. Kane asked me to deliver these," she said briskly. Julian appeared behind Amelia, his face shadowed. The papers were custody documents, legal steps to formalize Amelia's role in Daniel's life. Amelia's heart pounded. This was progress, but also a reminder of the hurdles yet to overcome. That night, as she sat with Daniel reading a bedtime story, she whispered, "We're building something real, Danny. Something worth fighting for." He smiled sleepily, clutching her hand. "I know." Days passed, and the weight of the custody papers lingered in Amelia's thoughts. Julian and Amelia sat together one evening, reviewing the legal documents under the soft glow of the desk lamp. "We'll face this together," Julian said quietly, reaching for her hand. Amelia looked up, surprised by the tenderness in his voice. "I want to believe that." Daniel's laughter echoed from the living room, a sweet reminder of what they were fighting for. The next morning, Amelia watched Daniel run to the school bus, his backpack bouncing with each step. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope, a future where they could all belong. Weeks turned into months as Amelia, Julian, and Daniel found their new rhythm. Amelia had moved into a cozy apartment closer to the penthouse, so she could be nearby. The mornings were filled with laughter and hurried breakfasts, the evenings with homework and whispered stories. One Saturday, Julian surprised them both by taking the day off, something he rarely allowed himself. They spent it exploring the city, Daniel's delight contagious as he pointed out every new sight. At dinner that night, Julian looked across the table at Amelia and Daniel, the two most important people in his life. "I don't say this enough," he began, voice soft, "but thank you for staying, for believing in us." Amelia reached out, squeezing his hand. "We're building something better, together." Daniel grinned, "Best family ever." The moment was simple, but for all of them, it was a victory worth cherishing. The holidays arrived, bringing both warmth and tension. Amelia decorated Daniel's apartment with strings of twinkling lights and homemade ornaments, hoping to create a sense of magic for the boy who had missed so many childhood celebrations. Julian was distant at first, caught up in business demands, but a rare evening free allowed him to join them. Over dinner, old wounds surfaced, a fleeting argument about responsibilities and fears, but ended with a quiet apology and a shared glance that spoke volumes. Later, Amelia tucked Daniel into bed, brushing a stray curl from his forehead. "We're going to get through this," she promised softly. As she stepped out, Julian waited by the door. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being the family he needs." Amelia nodded, heart full. The journey was far from over, but the path was clear. Spring brought renewal, but also unexpected trials. Daniel struggled with schoolwork more than usual, his frustration boiling over in silent tears. Amelia and Julian exchanged worried glances, unsure how best to support him. One afternoon, Amelia sat beside Daniel at the kitchen table, gently guiding him through a tricky math problem. "You're doing great," she encouraged, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. Julian watched from the doorway, his heart aching to bridge the gap he felt growing between them. That evening, he surprised Amelia with an old photo album, pictures of Daniel as a baby, moments she'd never seen. "I want you to have these," he said softly. Amelia's eyes shimmered with tears. "Thank you. It means more than you know." Together, they faced the struggles ahead, their family bond growing stronger in the face of adversity. Late one evening, Julian and Amelia found themselves alone on the penthouse balcony, the city lights stretching endlessly before them. Julian exhaled slowly. "I never thought I'd be here trying to build a family after everything." Amelia smiled softly. "Neither did I, but maybe that's what makes it worth it." He turned to her, eyes reflecting the distant stars. "I want to be better. For Daniel, for you." Her hand found his, a silent promise passing between them. Inside, Daniel slept soundly, dreaming of stars and the family slowly coming together around him. The next morning, Amelia woke to the sound of soft footsteps. Daniel stood at the bedroom door, clutching a small hand-drawn card. "For you," he whispered, eyes bright with hope. Amelia took the card, unfolding it to reveal a picture of their little family. Stick figures holding hands beneath a shining sun. Tears filled her eyes. "It's perfect." Julian appeared behind Daniel, a rare, genuine smile lighting his face. Together, they stood in the quiet room, a family bound not just by blood, but by love and determination. Weeks later, Amelia watched as Daniel took his first steps on stage for the school play, his nervous smile radiant. Julian stood beside her, pride evident in his eyes. When the curtain fell, Daniel ran into their arms, triumphant and happy. Amelia whispered, "We did this together." Julian nodded, wrapping them both in a warm embrace. For the first time in years, the future looked bright, filled with hope, healing, and a love they would never take for granted.